Welcome to Justice at Work, Employee Rights and Protections in the Workplace.
Welcome back to Justice at Work, real talk from Philippatos PLLC. My name is Kevin Rosenquist, and I'm here with Erica T. Healey-Kagan from Philippatos Law, where fighting for fairness in the workplace is more than a profession, it's a mission. Each week, we break down the rights you didn't know you had, the systems that stacked against you, and the legal paths that can set things right. Whether you're facing discrimination, harassment, retaliation, or injustice on the job, we're here to help you understand your power and how to use it. Today, we're talking about National Transgender Awareness Month. Erica will discuss what progress has been made for transgender employees, what challenges remain, and how the law continues to evolve to protect everyone's right to dignity and safety at work. Erica, welcome back. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you and to hear you for our podcast listeners.
Oh yeah, that's true. Not everybody's on the video end, so I'm excited to talk about this. Why is National Transgender Awareness Month such an important time to talk about workplace equality?
Yeah, I tell people a lot that the work we do is really important because we all spend so much time at work. So we want to be comfortable. We want to be, capable of maximizing our skills and our talents, right? So we want the work environment to be a place that everyone is comfortable, right? We want employers to be able to hire the best people, and have them in an environment where they're maximizing, their output, their creativity, right? Just comfortable in a way that they can do their best work. And part of that is valuing all of our differences, celebrating the ways we're the same, but also the ways that we are, right, distinguishable for one another. So National Transgender Awareness Month is a great time to, think about all of our employees, and what they bring to the table, and valuing everyone's ability to self-identify their gender identity and their gender expression.
What specific protections do exist for transgender employees under federal law, and how do state laws like those in New York build upon those?
Yeah, so as we've talked about in some of our other podcasts, the law is complicated, right? The discrimination law, kind of depending on where you live, where your employer is based, it can be a little bit convoluted. But federal law does protect transgender employees. The Bostock decision, which again we've talked about in some of our other podcasts, was a really excellent decision out of the Supreme Court. I think we're going to talk about it a little bit later today as well. But the Supreme Court basically said that Title VII, which is the federal non-discrimination law, it protects all of us from discrimination on the basis of our sex, and that includes any discrimination or differential treatment based on a person being transgender. Because in essence, what the theory is that if you're treating me differently because I'm not maybe what you expect a woman to look like, or because someone else is, not what you would expect a man to, identify like or dress like, that is discrimination based on sex. So transgender employees are protected under the federal law in that way. And then when we look at state and local laws, such as New York State, New York City, and many other localities as well, oftentimes we see that the protections are even more encompassing in the sense that they are clearer, and there's more ways in which we can argue to the court that certain actions are unlawful if they are fueled by bias. So in New York City, for example, it's not just, treating someone differently because they don't look like the type of man you expect, but it's also if you refuse to use the pronouns that a person has told you that they identify by, right? So if I told you I use she, her pronouns, and perhaps because of the way I dress, you start calling me he, him, or you start calling me Eric rather than Erica, right? You are therefore harassing me based on my gender identity and my gender expression, and that also is prohibited under New York City law, right? So there's kind of different levels of how broad the protections are when you get down into some of the states and the cities that have broader protections. Another way that New York City, for example, protects transgender employees even more than federal law is that New York City also protects against being treated differently because of your perceived gender identity or your perceived gender expression. So again, if someone looks at me And, I tell you, I am a woman, my name is Erica, but you see I'm wearing a bow tie and a suit, and you maybe, get a feeling that like you're not quite, vibing with the way that my identity matches with my expression, and you kind of have assumptions about me or perceptions about me, and you treat me differently because of that. That's also illegal. So again, it's kind of from the most obvious to sometimes a bit of a more nuanced situation. We sometimes see more protections and more clear protections on the local level.
Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying. And you brought up Bostock versus Clayton County. How have courts and employers actually adjusted to this ruling in practice?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different ways to, put policies in place to make sure that you're protecting folks regardless of how they identify in terms of their gender, that you're, providing resources and, bathrooms and locker rooms and kind of different establishments in your workspace to allow people to both, identify the way they want to identify, and also be comfortable in doing so. So one way in which we've heard a number of workplaces have made some changes is when you have a single stall restroom, right? Once you go in there, you're the only person in there. No one's joining you. You lock the door behind you. Make all of those restrooms gender neutral, right? It doesn't have to be men's and women's.
Yeah. What's the
Right?
difference?
I'm
Yeah.
in there by myself. It doesn't matter who I am, right? Right. So in terms of thinking about ways in which you don't even really need to make changes to your facilities, but you can make just changes to the signage or, what's being told to people about who can use that room and who can use that room. Just kind of, lowering those barriers that make maybe uncomfortable situations develop that just don't need to be. So there's kind of simple fixes like that. We've also seen a number of employers who have changed the paperwork that they use, which allows, rather than asking employees to choose male or female, whether it's when they're applying or whether they're registering, for benefits, allow a person to self-identify. So if it's
Mhm.
instead of saying, checkbox man or woman, you can just have a line or at least have male, female, and then, an other, and allow a person to self-identify. And that's really helpful because folks who do not identify as either male or female, whether they identify as non-binary or genderqueer or androgynous. There's different ways that people identify, and we want to kind of meet people where they're at and be respectful of the choices they've made for themselves. To be able to self-identify, and then for their coworkers to, utilize the language that they want to use. And then I would say a third very helpful change that a lot of employers have made is including pronouns, gender pronouns, in people's email signatures or
Mhm.
kind of in other outward facing ways. And that's helpful just because it's great to make it more commonplace that we're all
Mhm.
aware, right, of our pronouns. But it's also helpful in case an employee does, right, go through a process where they, go from using one set of pronouns to another. It's difficult to have to come out to every single one of your coworkers, right? But if there's just kind of either an email signature or another type of way that everyone shares their pronouns, whether it be at meetings, or like in group environments, if everyone's doing it, then the person who's introducing, what they would like you to call them is not the only one, making a change. It's something that everybody does. So those are a few
Mhm.
ways to try to just some subtle changes that will make a big difference for some of your employees.
I got to tell you, Erica, I love the all gender bathrooms, especially when my 5-year-old is with me, because we got some privacy. He's not talking about what anybody else is doing in there. It's really like I
Not
don't.
sticking his head underneath the
Yeah,
stall and
yeah.
causing
Daddy,
trouble.
that guy stinks. It's like, oh, buddy, don't say that. That's mean.
Yep.
But yeah, I don't. I think they're great. I actually really do like them.
100%. And that's the other thing is making changes, whether it's intended to make families more comfortable
Yeah,
or, transgender folks or just people who are shy. There's lots
yeah.
of
It's true
these
too.
private spaces, whether it's locker rooms or bathrooms, there's lots of different people that would prefer some privacy in those spaces. So, yeah, you
Yeah,
can make these subtle changes that make a big difference.
I would imagine when someone begins transitioning on the job, that can bring up issues, I guess more immediately or maybe a little more intensely? What do you see as the biggest issues that come up in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, there can be many issues, right? And sometimes it depends whether you're a small business, a large business, whether you're client facing or not. And we encourage employers really to, think through what's best for the employee, right? If they are client facing and, there's any concerns that they have about continuing in that process during their transition, speak to the employee about what is important to them, right? And how they want to be addressed, and how they want to show up to work, and really have a conversation about what's best for that individual, rather than right making assumptions about what you think is best if it's not something that you have any experience with or you don't understand. I think a lot of trouble that we see crop up is sometimes because people just don't understand. Maybe they've never been through that type of experience, right? Or they've never felt any sort of question or ambiguity in terms of their gender identity or expression. So they might feel that they're doing the right thing, but they're actually making the employee who's transitioning feel quite uncomfortable. So
Mhm.
it should be an open conversation. It should also be a conversation where there's no wrong answers, right? Or as long as everyone is well intentioned, we often see the ball move in the right direction, right? I think if you ask anybody who's ever gone from using one set of gender pronouns to another, sometimes people mess up, right? Sometimes people with all the
Yeah.
best intentions, maybe they've known you for a long time and they accidentally use the pronouns you used to use, or maybe they accidentally use the name you used to use. As long as you just kind of own up and say, my bad. I know that was wrong. I'm working on it. That is way better than kind of making a big deal out of it, and kind of having a whole big to do, and then having a whole like employee meeting where you're making a big deal out of, we need to do this, we need to do that. Again, it's important to meet the employee where they're at and understand what's important to them in this process, so that you're on the same page to make sure that the transition goes as smoothly as possible. Obviously, on the flip side of that, when we sometimes see, you know, harassment or other unlawful conduct crop up, that tends to be, again, people who are not well intentioned, people who obviously are fueled by bias and discriminatory beliefs about people and how they should identify, and unfortunately, that sometimes can look like purposely misgendering a person, time and time again, or constantly using a person's name that they used to identify by. And those are the types of issues where unfortunately sometimes we do see those types of cases, and those are the types of issues that we would tend to bring claims about, because that is when you're getting into the realm of unlawful conduct, because that's harassment, and especially if it's intentional, it shouldn't be happening. And so again, there's a lot of it has to do with just intentionality and goodwill versus something else that's not as
Right.
respectful, which
Yeah. So let's get to let's keep going with that. If an employer, refuses to respect a worker's gender identity,
Mhm.
or or they're being harassed, what are the legal remedies and the process that someone should handle?
Yeah. So I would say if if in your workspace you've identified with a certain name, with a certain set of gender pronouns, and you feel, again, it wasn't just a one off mistake, it's really that someone's not respecting the name, the pronouns, the title that you've asked them to use, I would immediately seek legal counsel. And not just because I'm an employment attorney, but
Right.
because there's a lot of different things that you could do, right? And once you meet with legal counsel, they will probably help you to keep a record of what's happening, right? So that it might not be advisable to immediately file a lawsuit or immediately file a complaint with a government agency, but the attorney can help you to identify what's happening, whether it's illegal, the evidence, kind of the best evidence that you can use to prove what's happening and to prove how it's harming you, right? So there's kind of a number of different factors, but ultimately, full stop, if you feel like you're being misgendered, especially if you feel like it's intentional, if you feel like it's not getting better despite using your best efforts to tell your employer how you self-identify, it's definitely advisable to meet with an an employment attorney and just talk about your options. And again, keeping a record of what's happening is very important, but then getting that legal guidance for what you can do next to make sure that you're understanding your rights and staying on that path of remedying what has happened and getting compensated if there's a way to do so, which there could be.
Obviously, a lot of workers are going to fear retaliation when they speak up. That happens all the time. But specifically in this situation, what does the law say about that? And what should employees document if they're concerned about it?
For sure. Yeah. And I will say oftentimes, again, we encourage folks to consult with an employment attorney as soon as possible if they, fear that something doesn't feel right at work. But obviously, by the time some folks come to us, they've tried their best to remedy it. They've hoped it would get better. They kind of don't want to, meet with an attorney. They feel like that's
Right.
going to, make it maybe a bigger deal than they want it to be. So sometimes by the time we meet with folks, lots of, issues have cropped up. Many conversations have happened. So what the law says about retaliation is that if an employee has made any sort of complaint, whether it's to human resources, although it doesn't have to be to human resources, it can even just be to your supervisor or someone in the chain of command for your employer, right? Your workplace, someone that is, in a supervisory position to you, that you feel comfortable talking to. If you have spoken to them and you've expressed a good faith belief that you are being discriminated against, although you don't need to use that word, right? If you've expressed what we often hear people saying is, I told them I felt like I was being treated differently, either because of the way I dress or because of the name I use or the pronouns that I use. If you've made that sort of complaint or expressed those types of concerns, that's considered protected activity. And if your employer then either terminates you or suspends you or disciplines you in any way, and there's a connectedness, there's a causation there that makes it seem plausible that either the discipline or the termination was actually caused by the fact that you complained, that is retaliation, that is unlawful, and that can often be an additional claim in addition to, right, the first things that were happening. Sometimes we see someone being discriminated against or harassed, they complain, and then the misconduct continues. Again, sometimes they're terminated. So then sometimes by the time you come to an attorney, you might have multiple claims. And again, the attorney can speak to you about, strengths and weaknesses to those claims, what can be done about it. But I think what's most important is to document everything. And the reason I say that is because sometimes these protected activities, right? You speak to your supervisor, you tell them you feel like you're being treated differently. Sometimes that's all verbal. And if it's many weeks or many months before you speak with an attorney, sometimes it can be hard to remember what you said or remember how they responded. It also can then become a question of fact if we're litigating. It's like a he said, she said, or a he said, right? One person remembers the conversation one way, one person remembers it another. But
Yeah.
if plaintiff contemporaneously took notes about, right, what they said and what the other person said, that is often very helpful because those notes or any recordings that a person might have taken can be very helpful to prove, right, what was actually said and what was done in that meeting.
Wow. Well, interesting stuff for sure. Erica, thank you so much for that. And thank you for listening to Justice at Work, powered by Healey-Kagan PLLC. If you're dealing with workplace discrimination, harassment, or retaliation, or just want to know your rights, visit philippadoslaw.com to schedule a consultation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. We got lots more great stuff coming your way. Erica, I love chatting with you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.